Colleagues, since we still have a very tight agenda with two very important hearings on our hands, I think it's good to start this afternoon meeting. You know, we start to be a little bit tired. It's very intensive, but I think the advantage is we have all these type approval authorities in 1 day and a half. I think that's good to have a sort of overview. And I know, again, that's one of the reasons why some of the colleagues are coming in and getting out, and there's a lot of committee meetings this week, very important votes and so on. So I do know the difficulties. Nevertheless, we had a very interesting hearing this morning. Aujourd'hui, on a Monsieur Laurent.
Today we have with us Laurent Benoit and Beatrice Lopez from the UTAC CRAM group in France. Welcome to both of you. Thank you for accepting our invitation. Let me give you the floor. Without further ado, for a few introductory remarks. Thank you very much, and thanks everyone for having taken the time. I'm the Managing Director of UTAC CRAM, which is a private French company, independent, with the job of type approval testing in France. I'm going to present in a few slides the UTAC CRAM group to give you a better understanding of what we do. So I hope everyone can just about see that. 400 engineers, stroke technicians, 2 test areas around Paris and the Paris and environs, 52 million turnover, 25% international. We've got 2 international sites, one in China and one in Russia, and we work with 40 countries or so, and with the administrations. If you look at the type approval certificates in Europe, we are the leaders in M1 and N1. I'll try to not go too fast. Key dates, this is just the background. Just to give you an idea, we started our business in Linas-Montlhéry, which is very historical. 1924, the first building took place, and the first world records were set. And the start of European projects working on consumption started there. And on the speed front, stabilized speeds were set exactly there. So LUTAC was set up in 1945. That's what it's called, with the laboratories, mainly based in the Linas-Montlhéry site. And then we bought a second one north of Paris in 2008, acquisition of the Mortefontaine Test Centre. Now, references, UTAC is not a type approval place in the sense of MOT. We're based on road vehicles, anything which drives on the roads. That's automobiles, but not just cars. Manufacturers there have been French manufacturers, but others as well, German, British, Japanese car makers and others. We work with the equipment people worldwide. We work in agriculture, military, transport, energy, distribution, which gives us a presence in anything connected to road vehicles. Anything which can be given permission to drive on the roads. So, 5 basic types of work, regulation and type approval, and Beatrice Lopez is director for that entity of regulation and homologation, and will be well placed to take your questions. There is a big body which is called SS Expertise, which is all the labs I'll be showing you, and other sectors, certification, advice, consultation, and training, driving techniques. So we have an important role to play in the whole area of homologation and type approval. I can imagine that many questions will be directed to this area. Something which is quite important is that we are leaders in regulation with major activities in Brussels and Geneva, where we sit on many working groups. This is one of the hallmarks of UTAC, one of its fortes, if you like, which gives it it's very grounded worldwide in all the European and global regulatory bodies. World recognition. I would just stress this one because we have a technical service in France, the UK, the Netherlands and Romania. In other words, 4 countries. And we have other international recognitions which are less relevant for today's purposes. Now, on the trials, expertise, tests, that's our labs where we do regulatory testing. We have an EN4. There are 4 places in Europe, and we provide technical assistance and test plans. That's stand tests and also benchmark tests for performance on products. There again at on demand. For these laboratories, testing and expertise, rather than a long speech, just a quick aperçu. We've got the environment lab, which is basically noise and vibration, electromagnetic compatibility, emissions and consumption, and that's cutting-edge labs. Then second column, safety, active safety and also passive safety. And then finally we have a durability lab, 2 test centres, so there are many tracks in order to check many aspects of road vehicles and their performance. And that's the end of my part of the presentation. If you have any questions, I'm at your disposal. Thank you very much. I'm sure there will be many.
Colleagues, we move to the questions. I have to say, this morning we had a little bit more of time. We don't have that this afternoon, so I'll be stricter again with the timings, just so that everybody is aware of that. Mr. Zalba.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much. First point, when did you realise that there was this discrepancy between lab emissions and real driving emissions? And did you do something once you discovered this discrepancy?
Oui, merci pour la question. Quand vous parlez des émissions, c'est...
Thank you. What sort of emissions are you talking about when you talk about emissions?
El control de emisión.
I'm talking about emission control in real driving emissions and emissions control in laboratory. Did you realise there was a big discrepancy? Well, now we know there is. And once you discovered this discrepancy, did you do anything about it?
Oui, donc je pense que vous parlez des émissions d'oxyde.
When it comes to NOx emissions, we were informed about this gap when we had access to the SIC, the in-service conformity. We heard about the work on the new RDE, and we, as a technical service, we're not there to try to study these gaps as a technical service, because today we apply the legislation and the regulation as it's drafted in current text. So we comply with the existing regulation, and today the applicable regulations and the measurements are carried out in laboratories with us.
Ahora la Comisión Europea.
And now the Commission has made a new proposal, and emissions control will be carried out under real driving emissions. How will this affect you, do you believe? First of all, how will it affect your processes? And secondly, how will it affect vehicles and diesel technology? It will have an impact, obviously, because I think that you'll be much more had to be much more demanding. So how will you adapt to this new reality?
Oui, donc tout à fait.
You're right. Today, with the new regulation that's been adopted, which is called the RDE, Real Driving Emissions, we will have emissions which are much closer to what happens in reality, because emissions will be measured on the spot, not in laboratory. So obviously, development of vehicles will be different, because there will be much stricter tolerance levels than we have today. So from that point of view, vehicles will be better when it comes to their emissions.
Et ces règlements.
And these it takes time to get these regulations. Obviously, implementation will only start as of 2019.
En termes de technologie,
in terms of technology, there's a lot of technology on the market already, and then you have to strengthen and consolidate this technology so it's able to work in all conditions. And that sometimes takes a little bit of time, obviously, but already today there's technology such as SGR for diesel, as we're talking about diesel, which is effective. So that we have to work on that, and we have to, SCR, we have to work on SCR, and we have to work on this so that we can then, and RDE will force us to do that. Well, I like your optimistic vision. Don't you think this will mean us constraints on the potential of the diesel industry in the European Union, because it will have to adapt to this new reality, and diesel vehicles will have to meet these new, more stringent measures. Won't that be a constraint on the development of the industry?
pas tout à fait des questions.
Well, this isn't really a question for technical service. This is a question for the manufacturers, rather. All we can say is that in the regulations, you already need a little bit of time. You need to allow time for technology and for manufacturers and equipment makers who work with the manufacturers so that they can then perfect the right technologies. So if there's time, then the RDE should be something that will allow us to have something that is applicable on the European market.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, both of you, for being here. Now my iPad switches off and my fingerprint doesn't work anymore. Yes, there it is. Privacy. Let me start by thanking you for your straightforward answers on whether temperature windows and cycle beating after 20 minutes is considered a defeat device. I think you're very clear and straightforward in your answers. And also your definition of normal use might be the one that close to 100% of the people outside this room consider normal use, that outside the laboratory conditions. So I would like to thank you for that. But I do have a question that we've also discussed yesterday afternoon and this morning, and that is about your possibilities to test cars beyond the regular NEDC test cycle. Because you answer that this is the problem. We do not have any possibility to systematically detect an illegal defeat device in the current regulation. Your answer to question 8. Why not? You can do whatever you want as long as you do not use it for the official type approval. You can confront a car manufacturer with the results and ask them to explain why the emissions suddenly are 20 times higher when you use a different test cycle. You can also do it within the NEDC by turning it around or changing it a bit. So there are several ways to check. I know legally you cannot use it for type approval, but you can check yourself whether this car also behaves in the same way when the test cycle is not exactly as defined in the regulation. Why are you not doing that, and why haven't you done that in the past?
Merci beaucoup pour la...
Thank you very much for a very relevant question. Once again, you said when you asked your question, from a legal point of view, as a technical service, we have to apply the regulation, and the French technical service can't do anything different than in Spain, for example. Otherwise, there would be diversions. I don't think we'd have many more customers left. What you describe as being asked for by the authorities as a technical service about whether we apply different rules than in the regulation, all that has a cost in terms of material. We're not paid to do these extra tests. We're paid to do the type approval tests. So it's very much a material question.
You've never been asked by any national authority to do so, because it is their legal obligation to enforce European legislation, and Article 5.2 is about defeat devices. We've seen many studies and other clear evidence that people were all around aware of the existence of, whether it were defeat devices or cycle beating techniques, but you've never been asked to go any further in your analysis, in your test, than just the regular NEDC test, which is from the first to the last second completely known to the car industry.
Donc, encore une fois.
Once again, we have within a type approval, we've never been asked to see what happens outside of the regulated tests. Studies might be asked for.
Have you ever done it yourself, just out of curiosity?
Non.
No.
Not on a Saturday morning or...
Surtout pas un samedi matin.
Certainly not on a Saturday morning. No. We've never gone beyond the cycle.
Oui, merci.
Thank you. I will continue on Mr. Gerbrandy's question. What you were asked to do within the Royal Committee. You did a test on 85 vehicles. I think you used pen systems to see if there was any deviation. Could you say some more about that? And did you possibly come across any defeat devices?
Oui, donc effectivement.
Yes, we were designated in the so-called Royal Committee to carry out tests for the committee. We had 3 types of test. One type of test was in the published French report, the D1, to see if the car realized if it was on to try to trick the vehicle. The second test, we've changed the conditions. We compared the test with and without these change of conditions. The third test was using PEMS in real conditions and to reproduce the NEDC cycle. So with these 3 tests, which are outside of the regulation, because it was a particular request from the French authorities, we did see some gaps there, some differences there. You said that they're outside of the regulation, except there is an article in this regulation which is very precise, which said that these emissions limits should be respected in normal conditions. There are lots of explanations of the texts, but normal conditions are definitely not in laboratory, and there is a large deviation between the real conditions of these vehicles and the test for the first certification. Have you taken measures which you should, either to withdraw type approvals or to do extra tests. Once again, we're just a technical service. So that's a question for the French authorities. It's not up to withdraw a type approval. Have you made some suggestions to the French authorities? You mentioned the Royal Committee. In the conclusions, there are some recommendations, and there are some interesting things in these recommendations following the results of the 86 vehicles. In your precise replies, you could talk about temperature windows or the system being switched on after 22 minutes. Did you see the vehicles tested? We haven't actually seen that. What about other vehicles with the window, with a smaller window? We never saw the type approval. I'm not talking about the type approval. Did you see these defeat devices? We saw the deviations, and we asked the manufacturers why there were these deviations. What do you think of the idea of having a European authority that could be above all these national authorities, like yours, to regulate and to make sure that the system is more efficient at the European level? Do you think that's a good idea or not? So that's, quite frankly, we could have a European authority to make sure that all the technical authorities work in the same way. Our job is to make sure that there are no differences from one technical service and another. So we would be in favour of there being a European authority.
Unintentionally, I skipped you.
Thank you very much. I have a question just to clarify. Is your organization, are you only the technical level, or are you also the authority that grants type approval?
Donc en fait, nous
We are technical service. I'm not saying, well, I don't want to say only technical service. We are a technical service. That's not bad. And then the French authorities, which issue approval, which sign the type approval sheet, that's called the CNRV. So the CNRV is part of the Environment Ministry. So we are not an authority.
My question, and I think other colleagues are asking similarly, also hearings that we've had earlier today, it's a question of I'll look to the future. Maybe others will ask you again about defeat devices. But looking to the future, I think it's quite important that we understand as legislators what would need to be improved in the system so that there would not be these problems as we've had now. So consumers have been misled as to what the actual emissions are, have been buying for years vehicles that apparently do not conform to what the law says or what the sticker on the car when you buy it is. And we've seen that there is a very strong interaction between the OEMs paying for the type approval. So you could say there's not financial independence and potentially a conflict of interest, certainly a perceived conflict of interest. Whether it exists or not is a second issue. So what could you say about how the system in Europe could be approved? And also sort of following up what my colleague just asked about something which would be supra-national, so above the national level. Would that be a way to go, or do you think that everything can be taken care of the way it is now with smaller changes, and what would they be? So it's a very broad question. I'll give you the rest of my 3 minutes.
Merci.
Thank you. Well, once again, I'm just giving you the UTAC view. I think what we experienced over the last year, well, we realised, of course, that type approval doesn't solve all problems. That's one thing. We discovered that in some vehicles, that type approval didn't spot certain things. Quite frankly, I think that market surveillance could really deal with a lot of your concerns, because there that's a real life. What's on the market? It's what you experience in real life conditions. So I don't know whether this is normal use or not. But with market surveillance, you're looking at the vehicle in service and the effects of driver behaviour. So market surveillance could answer some of your questions. But actually setting up this market surveillance, whether it should be national or European in nature, that's another debate. But that could be one of the ideas, one of the ideas or one of the answers to your question.
Surveillance, I understand that this would be once a vehicle is actually sold off the production line, how it's behaving in the world. Now, and this is a question that my colleague Gerbrandi was asking earlier, I understand that the law requires of you what the law requires, and it's very important that you follow the law and you do the tests according to the prescribed questions. But I guess I'm trying to understand better what keeps an organization such as yours from asking these more fundamental questions that would say, is that which the law is requiring us, does this actually make sense? I mean, in the world of medicine, doctors have to fill out many forms, and I understand that often they think, well, actually, this has little to do with patient health. Mm-hmm. And similarly here, it seems that your organization and others like yours, you're required to do certain things, but as a doctor, you seem to know a little more than others. What has been keeping you from making suggestions that it should be changed, and maybe many years ago?
Alors, bon, encore une fois, peut-être.
Well, once again, my answer will be a bit straightforward. Today, once again, the rules are European, even if there are things that we know, as you've said, as a good doctor, you know what you need to look for, but you can't say, because Mr. Manufacturer, you come here, but I'm going to do something different than what is written in the rules. I don't think the consumer would benefit much. We're paid to carry out these tests. Either the regulation says very clearly that we authorise the technical service to, or we encourage the technical service to do this, or the approval authorities encourage the technical service to do such and such, then you've been in a different context. There we could go and seek out something else, look for something else, but at the moment the legislation is such that you can't do it, because you wouldn't get away with doing it for very long. I'd just add that the future regulation with different temperature levels, with RDE and with the WLTP, all this will contribute to strengthening the functioning of the system. So when you go through all of these tests, you can certify afterwards that the vehicle that you have given type approval to is fine. And then, of course, you've got to check that the production line cars that go onto the market remain at the same level achieved by the type approved vehicle. Thank you very much, Mr. Sosnowski.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. ITAC, as you said, tests and oversees the testing of vehicles. Before the whole problem broke, before the whole scandal broke, didn't you think that something weird was underway? That defeat devices might be used in the tests that you were doing.
I know your tests were not set up to discover defeat devices, but did you not have a feeling that there was something wrong on the way?
Très honnêtement.
Very honestly, no. No.
All right, thank you. In your answer to question number 8, you say that today you do not have, under the current rules, you are not able to detect an illegal defeat device. Do you think that the new proposal using the RDE system actually solves this problem? So the testing and type approval are sufficient, and is the new system bringing you enough in the way of instruments, or do you think there should be something else on top of what is there right now in the proposal?
Alors pour ce qui est disponible.
As regards the defeat devices, well, I think the future text will allow us to home in more effectively. We're looking at much broader ranges of temperature, and there'll be limit conditions as well, which are much broader. So the tests will cover a much broader scope than the laboratory testing, so that will help us in our efforts. However, actually detecting what might be illegal or not, I think that would be much more complicated, because there's lots of different software available, and at the moment the texts don't deal with that.
All right, I understand. My last question. Today in the Transport Committee there was a debate on the approval of motor vehicles system, and we were considering a possible superordinate agency or a surveillance body that would oversee this kind of mechanisms. I'm afraid that this might be an extra tier of bureaucracy. Wouldn't the right step be just extending the possibilities you've just described, a certain standardization, because an extra level of surveillance might not bring a solution to the real problem? For me, this would be rather about stricter rules or about a system of control that will actually use the latest progress, the latest knowledge. I believe that an extra surveillance authority might bring about more red tape for you, and we wouldn't progress in that way. So aren't you afraid of more bureaucracy in that proposal?
Oui.
Yes, if that brings more bureaucracy, then I don't think there'll be much in the way of progress in these matters. At the same time, what we are asking as a technical service is that there be identical interpretations of the legislation for all. So if you can have a body that would check that such and such a technical service, such and such a type of approval authority is applying the legislation, that would be a good thing, without, of course, wanting to add extra red tape. But I don't know whether that's easily to achieve. We have no answer today, in any case, to this question of whether we can detect defeat devices that are legal or illegal. We haven't made any progress in that context.
Dank u, mevrouw de voorzitter. I have one very simple question for clarification. On the European Commission's website, there is a list of national market surveillance authorities by country. And in the list of France, it says under motor vehicles, Direction Technique UTAC. I guess that is your company. So you are listed as a national market surveillance authority. Does that mean that besides the technical service, you also have a role as a surveillance authority?
Pardon, c'est une erreur.
That's a mistake. We're not at all a market surveillance authority. We're not so designated as such in France.
My other question concerns what you are actually capable or willing to do outside of the in detail described NEDC test. If, for instance, the French authorities would ask you to test the car in a lot of different ways, different than the standard NEDC test, would you be able to do so, and would you be willing to do so?
The competent authorities, in terms of type approval, can ask for tests if there's a risk from an environmental or safety point of view. If additional tests are asked for that purpose, yes, they can do that, and we would carry out those tests. And that's what we did within the context of the so-called Royal Committee.
Yes, because you in one of the previous questions, you said that you could not really do that as a technical service because also out of competition with others. But you would be able to take on board such a test if someone asks you to do so. Okay.
En fait,
The answer I gave you just now was in a systematic context. We can't do it for every type approval because it's not laid out in the text. We can't do anything outside of the procedures and the test cycle, but a request from an authority, we can do that if it's exceptional. We could do it even in different conditions than those in the regulation.
Looking at the future, because that of course is the other part, one of the things that we're struggling with in this committee is the competition between technical services and also type authorities, type approval authorities. Do you consider this competition healthy, or do you believe that that should be avoided in the future?
I think what should be avoided is competition for less than 10 years, less stringent. It shouldn't mean that this competition, that a manufacturer would go to one technical service rather than another because it's more flexible in terms of tests. We should avoid that totally.
Yes, but we also see that there are tendencies in member states to, how do I phrase this in the right way? Well, to maybe be less stringent, or at least to assist their national industries to pass certain tests. I'm not saying that that is against the law or whatever, but that there are certain mutual interests to make it to make certain car types passing the test. Do you have the feeling that that occurs within Europe? I'm not only talking about France. Do you have the feeling that maybe in Italy or in other countries that might be the case based on your own experience and knowledge?
We can reply for France. I can guarantee you that in France, that the interpretations are very rigorous. So there isn't this connivance between the authorities and the manufacturers. So I can't reply for other authorities or manufacturers.
Děkuji, paní předsedkyně.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I would also like to thank you for coming among us. I have a couple of questions to the written answers that you gave to our written questions. Number 8, in the second question, you say that issues connected to defeat devices, you've been able to inform the Commission about these. And then you looked at the development of the European regulation. What specific wording did you use, and who was present for the Commission, and when did it happen? When did such a meeting happen?
Oui, alors je voudrais juste apporter.
I'll just give you a slight correction. I didn't interpret the second part properly.
Especially in different working groups, c'était sur le fait.
That was the fact that, as a technical service, we like methodological guides. We thought that this meant that this willingness to have methodological guides with a view to type approval. Several times we indicated to the Commission that as a technical service we were favourable towards procedures which can't be interpreted between technical service. So sorry for that. I wasn't replying on defeat devices, actually.
A můžu se zeptat, komu?
Could I still ask, who did you talk to at the Commission? When was it, roughly? When did such a meeting take place that you wanted to choose a different procedure because this procedure was not perfect?
Alors, encore une fois,
once again, we were responding globally. Mr. Benoit said we have been following the working groups for 30 years. You're asking at which group did we say, yes, we would like the rules to be clearer? I can't really tell you. We're involved in developing the rules since the 1970s, since the first directive on emissions. Since then, we've been involved in the development of the regulation, and as a technical service we've been in these working groups where there are loads of people with their own interests. As a technical service where we want clear type approval procedures, that's our clear interest, to signal to the Commission. It's not the same person who's been there for 40 years. It's our interest to have clear procedures. It was in that sense that, yes, we've flagged up this interest as a technical service.
Dále bych se ráda zeptala.
My next question about answer 9. You talk about how difficult it is to define normal use. What definition would you suggest?
Très bonne question.
That's a very good question. It's complicated. We've followed the development of the RDA regulation. I can guarantee you that we spent hours of debates to define what is called the boundary conditions. What is normal conditions in the north of Europe or the south of Europe, the east or the west? What attitude, what temperature? There are all sorts of different usages. So it's not simple to define what is normal use. There have been definitions in RDE that we can use more, but frankly, it isn't simple.
Meneer Eickhout.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for being here. I also want to continue on the normal use, because in your answer, question number 10, you say that on normal use, it's a lack in the regulation not defining what is meant by normal use. Have you ever notified anyone about this? Because now you conclude it's a problem, but the law is there for decades, so I assume you've notified this to someone before then.
En fait, on n'a pas vraiment.
We haven't really studied in the regulation. We haven't studied that part. In recent years, before RDE came in.
Whether you studied it, but if you noticed that this was not clear from the regulation, then you notify.
Mais j'allais y venir.
I was coming to that. What you meant was that up to now, the type approval procedures were done in a laboratory. So there's no need for normal use then. There's another dimension now with RDE, so that the question arises. Up to today, we haven't had any use for normal use.
Well, that is an interesting statement, because as far as we know, the cars need to be in conformity with the law, and in 5.1 it's putting emission limits in normal use, and as you also yourself give in your answers, for you that means outside the laboratory. So we know that there is this NEDC test for allowing a car, the type approval. But then also in the law it says that you have to meet a limit, stay below a limit, and for example that the feed devices are prohibited. So these are things you also need to check, because a car needs to be in conformity. And what you said in previous answers is that you have never got a question to really look into these matters. And you said and also on the testing it would be difficult because there are no rules for. But how can there be rules in detail on detecting, for example, a defeat device? Because that can be different for any car. So there are no strict, there's just, if you get the feeling, hey, there is something wrong, you do tests. Why didn't you?
Once again, to know if something is abnormal within defeat devices, we would look for them. If you apply the regulation between 20 and 30 degrees, we wouldn't know what would happen above or below that. There's a problem in the regulation today, at least before RDE. The tests are done between 20 and 30. So if we don't see what happens above or below that, how can we detect that there's a possible defeat device?
When you were doing the NEDC test for type approval. However, you live in a world where you get information, and there are other testing facilities who came up with, hey guys, maybe this Renault, I just give an example, by coincidence, is performing worse outside that thermal window. That information was out there. Why did you then never thought, hey, let's in ourselves look at those cars outside the thermal window? Because they need to be in conformity. Not only for type approval, but also for air quality. They need to be in conformity.
Alors vous avez tout à fait raison.
You're right. That's what's happening today in France. Since we've known that there are emissions which aren't very correct, below 17 and above 35, France is trying to correct this temperature window, which is too narrow.
That research indeed of the French Inquiry Committee. You tested the 86 models, that was you, I guess.
Yes.
Okay, so, and there was some criticism on the report that on the Renault Captur there was language taken out of, which according to some sources they say there was really clear software in the Renault Captur on a NOx trap. And that was on the basis of measurements, but that was not in the final report. Can you confirm that indeed in the Renault Captur you found irregularities that were hinting at a NOx trap?
I'm not sure I understand your question. If
It was an article in Financial Times, so that
okay.
you must have seen that.
Okay, so a problem of calibration in Renault?
It was an article on the French inquiry where there was criticism that the report was not, that in the report some more painful conclusions were not put in because it was written by the Ministry of Environment and they were taken out, and some people said, part of that commission said, oh, but wait a minute, the Renault capture, there was some clear indication that software was used. And that was not in the report. Well, if that clear indication that Renault was using software, that must have been from your measurements. So could you confirm?
No, in fact, in UTAC, we do not conduct any software measurements. It's another company that's doing this.
I know you're not detecting the software, but if you are doing separate measurements and seeing peculiar behavior, which then can only be explained by that software is doing something, that of course comes out of your tests.
Alors, encore une fois, je vais me répéter, mais...
At the risk of repeating myself, we're a test laboratory. We do the tests as requested. So software, that's not up to us at all. The committee which was set up in France was designed to shed light on all the anomalies in vehicles sold in France. That's another part of the work of this committee. So I'd ask you to put your question to that authority. We're only there to do the tests on these 86 vehicles in the laboratory and on the bench.
We don't care about the report.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. And thanks for being here, and thanks for giving very clear replies to all the questions. I'm going to ask you a very simple question. When did you find out about the discrepancies between emissions tested in laboratory and emissions detected in real driving conditions? When did you really become aware of this?
En fait,
In fact, a bit like everyone, when some articles were published, where there was a measurement with portable measurement systems, the PEMS, which showed that the results achieved were not the same as in laboratory. So it was when these studies were published. Mrs. Gosset, so you don't have any, or you didn't have any indications that allowed you to imagine that there might be these discrepancies before that? And what relationships have you had with the manufacturers? Did the manufacturers propose you specifications, or do you have sufficient independence? And moreover, how can you ensure your independence vis-à-vis the car manufacturers? Well, that's a lot of questions at once. Well, I believe that now it's a well-known secret that everyone knows that before the WLTP, the problem was that there were sources of optimization, so there were tolerance levels, tolerance margins. So depending on the choices that went well, you could choices that were made, the better choices, you got better results. But these optimizations, these tolerance values were legal. We know it was used, but we never received the pressure from the manufacturers in order to move away from these optimized tolerances. They were rather favourable towards the manufacturers. So, in effect, we are paid by the manufacturers, but that doesn't prevent us from having integrity and independence. I say we've been doing this job for 50 years. If we hadn't been capable of showing integrity and independence, then everyone would know. And we don't want to lose our good reputation. No, I wasn't expressing suspicion or doubt. I just wanted to know what sort of relations you had and how these relations were organised with the manufacturers. And for the future, I imagine you've been forced now to carry out adjustments so that now you can properly set up these RDE tests. What are the investment, financial, personnel consequences for you? Are you taking the two time slots together? No, just one.
No, si.
Oui, alors effectivement.
Yes, we'll need investment for the future WLTP cycle. We'll have to adapt the test benches, the laboratories. That's going to involve a fair amount of investment. And then for the RDE, there as well, there will be investment in the equipment at the back of the vehicle to measure the emissions. And 300,000 euros in investment per PEMS, and above all, what's important, the training so people can use the PEMS. It's not straightforward. It's a fairly new piece of equipment. So we'll need to be sure that the measures are robust and reliable. So there's a lot of preparatory work so that you can have an appropriate use of the PEMS system. So there's the portable emissions measurement system. There's a lot of preparatory work that will take time. Yet the PEMS is entirely new technology, and the regulations led to its creation, and it's not entirely reliable at the moment. So we're carrying out trials with the Commission, and we are trying to ensure that we have more reliable PEMS that can be used. It's an important component. It's getting more important. So that's part of the investment. Other investment would be in laboratories, the roller benches, ventilators, that would allow us to get more reliable results. Because obviously in laboratory we're trying to get the conditions that are representative as possible of what's happening on the road, and that requires a lot of investment. But as a technical service, by definition, if I dare say, because most technical services create their own laboratories, and it's best if you're an expert, it's best to have the top-notch laboratories and the most recent technology.
Sì, grazie.
Thank you. What sort of services do you provide to car manufacturers or spare parts manufacturers?
En dehors.
Outside the type approval context. Well, outside type approval in the area of testing and trials, that's what you're talking about. In general, asked Mr. Paolucci. In general, we propose in our laboratories where we can carry out tests, we can carry out test plans, and there's one part of the legislation that exists to create a framework for the entire car industry, and beyond regulations, the manufacturers and the car parts providers have their own specifications for car parts that aren't part of the legislation, but which might allow you to meet the needs of consumers, the comfort needs of treaters. So there can be specifications from car manufacturers and car part manufacturers. It could just also be not just car manufacturers, but bicycle, tractor manufacturers. But we also carry out certification of management systems in factories. We work in other areas, also organising events. So we have a very broad array of different activities, because the type approval activity represents 20% of our turnover, as we said in the document. Thank you. Well, I'll carry on following up the last question from our colleague. I don't want to be suspicious, and I don't want to call into question the integrity and the professional nature of your technical services and the other private companies doing type approval activities. But don't you think, nonetheless, there's something we need to be reasoning on? Are you whether the checkers, whether the people carrying out the tests have a conflict of interest, a very clear conflict of interest between, and I don't think we need to deal with that when it comes to type approval, the conflict of interest between the manufacturers and the testers. or today, most of the crisis that we've been through, is above all obvious when it comes to the reliability of. It's not calling into question the reliability of technical services. The crisis, it calls into question legislation and the legislation's ability to allow us to check the performance of a car under real conditions, under normal use conditions. That's the problem, not the. It's a legislation that's at fault, rather than the other side that you mentioned.
Sorry, Mr. Schulze.
Ja, vielen Dank für Ihre Anwesenheit.
Thank you very much for being here. I have a couple of questions. I'm looking at the list here. You have Nissan in your list. The Korean authorities found a defeat device in the Nissan Qashqai. Have you found any similar things in your tests on Nissans? Today, that affair hasn't reached the technical service, so we're not up to date with what's happening between. I think there's a dialogue between authorities. Well, if you don't have the information, I won't ask any further. Second question, you're the only technical service in France with a private legal form, is that right? Yes, that's correct. It's a French particularity with our technical service since 1945, in fact. That's my question. Why is that the case? In Germany, my country, we have a lot of competing technical services. Does the French government have a stake in your company? No? There's no link between the government and our company? There's a history and confidence which is established every day in UTAC. There's no perfect model between administration and lots of technical service and our technical service. I think there are lots of possible models. It's a question for the authorities. And it's up to them to think what model would be best for the future. But I think there's plenty to discuss there.
Es ist zumindest als einziger, aber es ist Ihr Glück.
It's strange if you're a private company and you have no competitors. Last question, at least a remark. Just a little remark on the history. The model. The technical service models are linked to the various countries. Having customers outside the countries, the number of manufacturers in Germany is larger than those in France. That's just the historical reason.
Gracias, Presidenta.
Thank you, Chair. I'd like to ask. You've got Iveco and lorries among your customers, and I'd like to know whether you have the equipment to be able to check whether this defeat device that we prohibited in European legislation, whether that's triggered off before the lorry goes into the lab. I'm talking about lorries. And secondly, whether in the case of vehicles, although you're saying that you don't well, of course, it's hard to understand that given everything you do a lot, that you can't do anything about the algorithms. You can't do anything about this software that's in cars, given that you do so much. You have no formula for detecting in a car whether the defeat device is switched on or off when it comes into the laboratory. It seems surprising that you don't have means of doing that. Well, I didn't quite understand whether you were referring to light vehicles or lorries. The first question was about lorries. You do check lorries. You do test lorries. I imagine you check legislation, and in legislation it's clear that this is a ban, and I'm sure you check it. And when it comes to cars, I wonder whether you're checking light vehicles about whether these defeat devices are switched on or off, or whether you can't check whether the defeat devices are switched on or off in either of the cases. Well, we have material for carrying out tests on lorries, on roller benches, but we can't check. We're not supposed to check whether there's a defeat device. It's the same as with light vehicles. It's not up to us to do that. When it comes to light vehicles, what we can do to see what we could do, in inverted commas, to see if there is a defeat device. Well, if it's linked to temperature, we could carry out the same tests at different temperatures. In case so we could do a test at 30 degrees today and at 0 degrees, 10 degrees, 40 degrees on other days. There are different possibilities, but today that's actually not done. Could I add something? And well, that is that when it comes to lorries and coaches and the relevant legislation, we're being questioned today by buyers, by local authorities who want to buy buses and coaches, and they want to buy buses using different technology which reflect the most recent good technology, and they ask if we can carry out tests outside the regulation, like RDE tests, so that we can see what happens in normal use. So that's a very specific request that we get. That links up to a question earlier. When there's a specific request, we can then reflect on how we can try to ensure that our expertise actually serves the interests of the customer.
Non, on passe 3 minutes.
No microphone. The others have had more time. No, it's not according to the questions. If you can interrupt, our guest speakers to get in more questions. It's a question of timing. Everyone gets the same timing. You can interrupt. Mrs. Ayala Sender saying that well, she's got no microphone, so.
Oui, mais c'est mieux de.
It's best to have shorter questions in that case. Ask your question then. Ask your question. Go ahead. Ask your questions, but very quickly. Just to ask whether in the United States, because you are recognised by MECA, MECA, and are you asked to apply the same tests for NOx for cars as they do in America? And I imagine you'd have to, given that you are recognised, accredited in the United States.
La question est pour les.
You're asking about the United States. Yes. In the United States, this is just a recognition for equipment, safety belts, headlights. We're only not for vehicle testing, just for equipment.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I will try to be very brief. So thank you, first of all, for your answers and also for being with us today. As you know, there is now ongoing discussion whether or not to forbid the laboratory tests at the manufacturer's premises. Some member states want to do it, so I wonder whether you agree that it's a good idea, and if not, how can we ensure independent testing within the manufacturer's premises? And perhaps if you can comment, what is the situation today? Are most of the tests done in the technical services facility or at the manufacturers? Thank you.
Ce qu'on peut dire, c'est qu'au cours des dernières décades,
over recent decades, there's been a change in the way that type approvals are done. 35, 40 years ago, tests were 100% in the laboratory. Over time, it's been turned round. A majority of the tests are done at the manufacturer. Today, all the tests done at the manufacturer are witnessed by us. So we don't have anything done by the manufacturer themselves. Are we involved in the preparation of the vehicle? No. We are not involved in the preparation of the vehicle. We don't witness that. Otherwise, we'd be at the manufacturer all the time. When we carry out tests at the manufacturer, we validate the means. We see if the means are in line with what's required by the regulation. We have the same means in our premises. We have a good idea in terms of expertise. We have a good idea of what's required for the measures, and so that we are able to have an expert opinion on what's done at the manufacturer. Mrs. Grosstedt, thank you. You said just now you wanted to have a European control authority. You think? Does that mean that you think that type approval is different in member states? And do you have an exchange of good practices amongst technical services? Can interpretations be different? Yes, we've seen it. I can't say no. As for good practices, for some years we've been involved in the development of regulations. We have opposite numbers in Germany, France, Italy, involved in these various groups. We're trying to have a common position amongst technical services, and we try to agree on the way tests are done. So amongst technical services, we're trying to have these exchanges to have the best procedure when it comes to type approval. To continue on that quickly, what are the vehicles you use to carry out tests asked of you? Can you make sure? Do you have the feeling that they've been optimized at the last moment before they come for the test? Can you be sure about that? Even if we had some doubts on a type approval, that's not the most important thing. What we carry out is a type approval against a file that's been provided. What the important thing is the production. And the manufacturer will produce based on the benchmark. The type approval will take place eventually. What's the important thing is that what is type approved is then produced on the in the plant.
Oui, merci.
Yes, thank you. I had a question, and I've misplaced it. I know it's coming back. It's not coming back. There were two questions, very quickly. Now, the first one. You said that in order to respond to the demands of the Royal Commission, the tests you did, D3, they were extra tests. Now, PEMS, which you used, how long have you had that? How long have you had PEMS?
Ouais, parce qu'en fait...
Thank you. When we started with RDE, we got PEMS, which goes back to 2011. I'm not saying that that was the final version. It was really a prototype to test run, if you like, the methods and the procedures. But as Laurent Benoit said, when we had tests for the Royale Commission, I must say we had a number of negative tests because PEMS took a while really to run in. That was the first time officially that you'd been using it. For the Royale Commission, yes, for official tests. They had been used in order to kind of develop the method because we were involved in that whole process. But officially speaking, that was indeed the Royale Ch09 EN Royale Commission, Environment Minister. That was the first time. Yes, now you've said to colleagues that your job is to simply apply the rules. But of course the rules are based on emission limits. And there are thousands, hundreds of thousands of deaths per annum attributable to NOx. Now, for example, with the braking system, where I think that you've got rules and regulations applying in terms of TAA and type approval, that would be security standards. Would you have a conformity factor which would be from of 2 or 5, or did you have stricter rules which were simply to be adhered to? I'm simply asking, was it just in the pollution area that it was possible to double the standard which had been adopted and set, or whether that also applied to safety? Could you be 1/5 less safe in brake-wise? Well, it's very difficult to respond off the top of my head. But I think that, again, you've got to be above reproach when it comes to safety and environmental protection. Well, no, your colleague was saying that automotive manufacturers need time in order to comply. So you have a standard, and it takes there's a period, a running-in period, during which they can be twice the limit. But because you might say that's pollution, we can wait. But do we have the same tolerance and the same flexibility when we're talking about safety, in particular brakes? I think perhaps in the safety area we have got the so-called Euro N4 rules, which go beyond rules and regulations. And in terms of safety, all of the manufacturers operating in Europe will have the little star. And the rules, it's really ON4 which drives the process. ON4, we don't have the equivalent in safety of PEMS, where the conformity factor goes down over a period, but as there is a lead time in matters technological. Mr. Giesecke. Thank you very much. Mr. Benoit, Madame Lopez, thank you very much for coming to the Committee of Inquiry this afternoon to answer our questions. I'd like to ask a question about tampering and manipulation of software. Mr. Benoit, you were saying that in this area there's not been major progress in detecting manipulation. Now, you said you had 380 technicians. How many of them in this sector could claim to have software know-how and expertise? Oh, very few, since at the present time this is not an area of regulation where the technical services are required to have to intervene. So for purposes of regulation, that is not an area of specific competence. Now, to give you a steer, in the so famous Royale Commission, it was IFPEN, another laboratory which is connected to IFPE, and they were looking more specifically into the mathematics and the IT, the computing side of things. Of course, if trends go in that way, head off in that direction, then we can expect. We don't currently have the necessary. We're not tooled for that. But it is an area which is not without its complications. There have been successive committees set up in different countries, and they have tried to see whether it's possible to detect defeat devices and so on. But as far as I know, there have not been any real successes in that area, since it's taking a while to get up to speed in that area of the software. Mr. Giesecke, thank you very much. I understand currently you don't have the experts, but I have no doubt that you'll be going into training to increase the numbers there. On the question of PEMS, the Portable Emissions Measurement System, here in the committee we've heard a range of experts, and they've talked about tolerance of between an error rate of 10 to 20%, and you said it's far from 100%. Do we have reliable mobile infrastructure for the measurement of emissions? What kind of time frame are we looking at there, Mr. Benoit? First of all, you've got the reliability of the equipment, and that's still in the process of industrialization. It's going through the component supplier process. And in the Commission, for the Commission, we often have to conduct a test and then repeat them where the result we had was not acceptable because of difficulty in PEMS caused by sensors, for example. And with PEMS, I would have tended to say 20% in terms of tolerance, and it's about 20% reliability margin when you're looking at PEMS. Can it be improved? Is it going to be 100%? Well, you can see the little box that it is. You're never going to be up to lab conditions where things are quite precise, but in terms of reliability, over the past year and a half, we've seen real progress in PEMS reliability, but there's still plenty of scope. Thank you very much. The last questions are going to come from Mr. Eickhout.
Thank you very much. Maybe I'm just having one final question, which is just a bit, because I just don't understand it anymore. It's very clear all arrange for type approval. It's very clear type approval authority asking you as a testing facility to do the measurements, and then when it's done, all these testings are very detailed described. You do it, it's being approved if it's right, and then up the car is on the street. However, the type approval authorities also need to check whether the cars are in conformity in normal use. That's Article 5.1 of the legislation on air quality, where you say you have to be in normal use, stay below certain limits of emissions. Defeat devices are prohibited. So who is responsible that that part of the legislation is checked, that the cars are in conformity with that part of the legislation? Who is responsible for that?
Donc aujourd'hui, on a dit.
Thank you. Today, we've talked about type approval and production conformity, and we are also looking at checking an in-service supervision. That's in the context of the regulations. Now, once again, and you may not be happy to hear this, the normal use dimension has not really been developed in the type approval area. If the question is what's happening with RDE, well, it really is, in order to see what normal use and real world conditions is. But to be quite frank, we've not really had the tests in normal use of the kind that, as you would understand that.
It's not part of the type approval, and that's until now, and that we know, but a legislator needs to do more than only type approval, because it seems like once the car is on the road, no one is responsible anymore. That's not the case, I guess, because the rules are there. For example, defeat devices are prohibited. Who is responsible to make sure that that part of the legislation is followed?
Les autorités compétentes en matière.
Well, the competent type approval authorities, yep.
Okay, we have one now, so then we can ask them how they do that job. Okay, thanks.
And I guess also the market surveillance authorities, who are not the same Voilà, on est à la fin de votre...
Well, thank you very much. That takes us to the end of this section. Thank you very much for having come along and fielding all our questions. And there's still plenty scope for written replies to questions. 17th of October is our deadline for submission. Okay, so thank you very much for your time.
Okay, colleagues, let's proceed for the last hearing of this long session that started yesterday in the afternoon. En ik ben zeer vereerd om onze Nederlandse vertegenwoordiger.
It's a great pleasure to see André Reinders, our Dutch representatives, and Mr. Balk is here as well from the RDW. Thank you very much for having accepted our invitation. And I'm going to give the floor now to give us the introduction, and then it's for members to ask their questions. You have the floor, sir.
Thank you well. Dear members of the European Parliament, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. This late in the afternoon already. When I saw the article in the news on the Volkswagen case in September 2015, I know that I was aware that the media was not only interested in the discrepancies between the test and the reality on CO2 and fuel consumption, but also on the discrepancies for the pollutant emissions, and more specific for NOx emissions from diesel cars. I could at that time not foresee how big the impact would be for the European automotive industry. I could better estimate what the direct effect would be on the development of the second package of the RDE regulation, which was at that time in a final stage, and I was waiting for a Commission proposal. But first, I have to thank the Parliament's AMIS Committee to offer me the opportunity to inform you about the contributions of the Netherlands and the RDW in the development of better vehicle regulations, and more specific on the emission test procedure. I'm André Reinders, and I'm Senior Advisor Emission Fuels, working at the Netherlands Vehicle Authority, RDW. Allow me to short introduce RDW, which is an authority or an agency, and it performs its task on behalf of the Ministry of Infrastructure and Environment. It employs some 1,400 people. The tasks of RDW are in the fields of type approval, of parts and vehicles, the supervision and enforcement, vehicle registrations in the Netherlands, information provisions all over, and issuing documents, including driving license. So we are not only a type approval authority, we are more. The RDW participates in various international forums in the United Nations and in the European Union, where vehicle regulations are prepared on behalf of and in close cooperation with the Ministry. These activities are centralized in a staff department called the Vehicle Standards Development, which is a group of 8 experts who are dealing with different vehicle topics. In that respect, I'm the expert in the field of vehicle emissions. I'm head of delegation in the UN ECE Working Group on Emissions and Energy, the GRPE, which is a working group under the World Forum of Harmonization of Vehicle Regulations in Geneva. I'm also involved in a Brussels activity on emissions and CO2, and I act as a national technical expert for the Ministry of Environment and Transport and Infrastructure, sorry, and I act in several working groups, including the technical committee, the motor vehicles, the TCMV. When I look to the current emission regulation in Europe, covered by the Euro 5 and 6 regulation, this is adopted in co-decision, so with Council and Parliament. This regulation, 715/2007, and we have heard today a lot about that, lays down the fundamental provisions, not a specific definition, but the fundamental definitions on vehicle emissions. And the implementing measures of these co-decision regulation are in the technical specification adopted in comitology. And that is the implementing regulation 692/2008. In the type approval process, the technical service checks on the responsibility of the type approval authority the compliance of the emission limits and determine the CO2 value by using the NEDC test, the new European driving cycle. No other test could be used by the technical service. This is the case to avoid requirements that differ from one technical service to the other. As we all know, this test cycle is over 20 years old and not representative anymore for today's real-world driving. Specific for CO2 and fuel consumption measurements, this cycle will be replaced in 2017 by a new cycle, the Worldwide Harmonized Light Vehicle Test Procedure, the WLTP. This development of the WLTP, the new test cycle, is done under the United Nations and started already in 2010. The RDW Act on behalf of the Netherlands was involved in the process from the beginning, as well as the transposition of the WLTP in the European 5/6 regulation. But I go a couple of years earlier. I go back in 2006. During the development of that fundamental requirements for Euro 5/6, the European Commission, yes, already anticipated that the NEDC test would also not be sufficient to ensure low pollutant emissions on the road, like the NOx emissions. That was already anticipated in 2006. The Commission should consider the use of portable emission measurement systems, the PEM systems, and introduce a not-to-exceed regulation concept, so test vehicles on the road. By the introduction of Article 14.3, the European Commission was mandated to develop such a regulation under comitology. If I look to the development of the RDE, that was already started in 2011. It's more or less 4.5 years before the Volkswagen case. I have personally been involved in the beginning of the developing process to make sure that the Netherlands' opinion was properly reflected in the RDE meetings. During the process, several Dutch proposals were tabled and consequently adopted in the improvement of the technical provisions in the first and the second RDE package, which was adopted by the TCMV in May for the first and the second in October 2015. However, the outcome of the second RDE package from the final negotiations in that meeting in the TCMV on the 28th of October did not meet our Dutch position. More specific, the enforcement date, which was delayed by 1 year, and the increase of the conformity factor, what was originally tabled at 1.6, and it was a higher value was in the compromise to a factor of 2.1. Hence, the Netherlands voted against the negotiated result. But nevertheless, let me make clear that we are satisfied that we have now 2 new implementing regulations on RDE in force, which also include information from the manufacturers on the emission control strategies used, the AES and BES. We all know that the last phase of adopting the 3rd RDE package of RDE will again be shortly be voted in TCMV. And also there, some improvements from the Netherlands are included. Furthermore, an important part of this RDE legislation will be the 4th RDE package, with the possibility, within the type approval process, of additional RDE tests performed by independent parties on public roads. This can be seen as a marked surveillance issue, which is also part of the discussion at the moment in the Council Working Group concerning the new framework regulation on approval and marked surveillance. RDW is one of the parties involved in that decision-making process on the position of the Netherlands. I am not the expert for this topic, therefore I can only inform you on a general level. The Netherlands definitely support the intention of this proposal. We are positive that the proposal aims to improve the type approval system and for increasing the level of surveillance. We may be critical on some of the solutions that are chosen, but have and will propose other solutions that we believe are more effective and realistic and aim the same level of improvement. We can consider the new reality that exists after the Volkswagen case. Also, our national parliament shows great interest in this dossier, resulting in parliamentary questions and motions. These encourage a Dutch position on really improving the type approval system, including the level of stringency for all parties involved and increasing the level of surveillance. To conclude, let me confirm that the RDW will continue to play a key role in the development of robust vehicle legislation and will continue to be active in the development of emission regulations like the RDE. So I thank you for listening to me, and I'm available for questions you may have.
Dank u wel. Ik geef meteen het woord aan onze rapporteur.
And our rapporteur, Mr. Gerbrandy. Thank you very much, Madam Chairman, and many thanks to Mr. Reinders and Mr. Balk for their presence today and for their opening remarks. My question has to the subject which we've been looking at for the past day and a half, and it's really question 1. In the regulation, no trace
prescribed how to detect the existence of prohibited defeat device. En dat ook de reden.
And this is, of course, is the reason why we're not testing for that. And that really is squaring the circle. That's the circle. Because by definition, you can't find them with the standard tests. And because they were devised in such a way to circumvent that. And we don't know exactly what we're looking for. Now, when it comes to law enforcers or guardians, this poses one with real difficulties, particularly as it's been known for years that this existed, defeat devices, cycle beating, and all the rest of it. If you have contacts, I have contacts with TNO, which has been in the van, in the lead, in terms of identifying those practices. And my question then is, in what way have you tried to get a handle on the defeat devices, the cycle beating devices, because that, I think, is a subsection of the legal obligations which fall to the Dutch authorities. Thank you very much for that question.
De definitie en de beoordeling van...
The definition and the wording for defeat devices has been a very, perhaps unfortunate one, infelicitous one, which I think is the conclusion to draw from this session and previous sessions. When it comes to the manufacturer, they don't need to look and think of manipulation or tampering. That's the basic thrust of the directive. However, as you say, it's very difficult to look for things for different ways in which tampering can take place. Because by that time the manufacturer has incorporated that in the software, and it can be buried deep inside. And looking for something that you don't know about is a very difficult mission to be given. And this is why the Commission, with the conception of the Euro 5 package, said that we've got to look for a supplementary test method, not just NEDC and lab testing, but also on-road testing. This was one of the fundamental aspects of RDE, to limit the scope open to the frauds. Well, that's the future, of course. But as of 2007, it was becoming clear that defeat devices and cyclobeaters were not going to be found until real driving emission tests was up and running, and that's been about 10 years. How is that possible? Should it not be the job of the enforcer, the Dutch authorities, to see whether there's any suggestion of that such illegal devices are in use? And that can be done in a laboratory by running something for 22 minutes or 25 minutes. And KBA this morning was saying that was possible. And my question, have you never received instructions to explore that avenue? Well, quite so. We have done that, and that is clear in the reports. And it was clear that there were discrepancies between the lab results and the results that you get in an on-road context with the first version of PEMS. That was a workshop November 2010, and that was discussed and demonstrated extensively here in Brussels, that there were discrepancies between tests and reality, which would need to be plugged. Those gaps would need to be removed, overcome, because that was one has to look at the ultimate objective of emissions legislation. The focus was on improving tools for the type approval authorities, the technical services, tests which would reflect that. And the search for defeat devices was not the immediate purpose, because they were supposed to be banned. And there was trust and confidence, seriously, that manufacturers would not stray into actual tampering or manipulation. Thank you. Well, of course, trust is great, but I think that Renault, Fiat, and also Volkswagen have undermined that. And it's a great pity that there was not more rigorous testing over, 9 years? Well, thank you very much. As I say, as the only authority in Europe, it's quite difficult to do a large-scale inquiry. As the only authority in Europe doing that, Europe has got an internal market. We work with all the other institutes, and in the political world, and also looking at the studies conducted by the TNO, they were shown to the Dutch Parliament. There was no interest taken. No one was interested in the discrepancies between lab and road. That was not. People were more interested at CO2 emissions and gaps there with between labs and real world. And there was not that pressure, that head of steam, to pursue in this particular area. Thank you, Mr. Giesecke.
Thank you very much for coming to our committee. Here we have a very complex and technical subject.
Leider spreche ich kein.
Unfortunately, I don't speak Dutch. Otherwise, I have to speak German. I have to speak German. It has to be interpreted. But just to start in a simple way, it's they're complicated technical issues, but also the question of competence in the member states. And when you were introduced, you were introduced as an expert and an advisor. But are you a civil servant or are you an independent advisor? That's the first question. I need to know who is answering our questions today.
Ja, ik ben André Reinders.
Ja.
Well, I'm André Reinders, if you're trying to identify me. And I work with the RDW. And my department is equipped and mandated to be the Dutch voice in a very technical working group and to perform that function. And this we do in collaboration with the ministry. But the views expressed in the international forums, that is the Dutch input, the Dutch voice there. And that's not unusual because the RDW does perform state functions. Is that sufficient to reply? Yes, I'm an ambtenaar, I'm an official, civil servant.
Das war die richtige Antwort.
That was the correct answer. I expected you were a civil servant, but I would have trusted you even if you were an expert. That wasn't really the question. But yesterday and today we've heard from Italian and Luxembourg experts, and we've looked at the use of thermal windows. We've looked at defeat mechanisms which actually turn off the exhaust gas treatment systems after 22 minutes exactly, but the Italian representative said that was legal. But we've heard different interpretations of European rules. What do you think about these watchwords, thermal windows and defeat mechanisms, and then the exhaust treatment being switched off after 22 minutes? Is that in line with European law?
Voor uw vraag.
Thank you very much for that question. After all, the studies which have been conducted in the case of the Volkswagen instance, Germany, France, the UK, where there are also inquiries taking place, the findings so far from all of that is that there are all manner of different kinds of emission control strategies which have been used. And the question then is, are those strategies acceptable or not? Is that a defeat device? Is it an acceptable defeat device or not? Can the manufacturer indicate, can they tell us whether this modulation of the emission strategy is to protect the engine? Or is the technology there intended to regulate the emissions level across a very wide window? These are all the things which have come to the fore. And the important thing is for there to be a common approach to that Europe-wide. And the Commission is an important link in that chain in order to get that dialogue going between the different type approval authorities. That's what they have been doing. And there we are looking for an assessment of what things go on a list of tampering devices which need to be prohibited, which could then be clearly identified as unacceptable or illegal defeat devices at EU level. I think that was the question you were really asking.
Madame Bonnefoy.
Thank you. I will speak in French.
I'll carry on asking about these defeat mechanisms, defeat devices, and the answer you gave to question 8, you talk here about something which I find interesting, and I don't think I'm the only one. You talk about the guidelines for the concept JRC guidelines. Could you explain what's in these JRC guidelines that would allow us to detect the defeat devices?
Deuxième ligne de votre réponse.
It's the second indent of your answer to question 8.
Page 6. Page 6, second lines of your answer. For this, we use the concept GRC guidelines to perform the additional tests.
Ja, duidelijk. Sorry, ik moest even zoeken waar u precies...
Thank you. I was just trying to find the exact passage. Well, this follows on from a reply I gave earlier on, where there have been successive studies that have been published, and there are findings contained therein, which have come from the test programs. And it's important that at the European level, we operate in a level playing field kind of way. And I think that the only progress can be made if we do work together at the European level. And that means that individually, between Germany, the UK, and wherever else studies have been undertaken, the discussion continues. And we have asked for there to be guidelines given, provided by the European Commission, and they have said that they would do that in the relevant technical committee of the Council of Ministers.
Donc, vous avez...
So you followed this JRC methodology, the Joint Research Centre methodology. That's what you're saying in your answer to question 8. So have you had some initial results? Could these results be published? Could you give us detail about the results?
Ja, JRC heeft...
Yeah, thank you. The JRC has helped in describing the range of things which could be done quicker or slower than the NEDC, other speeds, and a range of different formats, if you like, which could be used for testing purposes to try to see what you're looking at. And we've done that in the RDW. With the Volkswagen case, we asked the question point blank, directly, is Volkswagen the only manufacturer involved? And the RDW also asked that question in light of our type approval decisions.
Did you use it on a car, and did you have to take off certification to a car because it was used with a defeat device? This is the specific question I asked.
Nee, we hebben alleen vragen gesteld.
Thank you. No, we simply put the question to the manufacturers whether they had ever seen anything similar to the Volkswagen defeat devices. They said they had not. And we had a harmonized program of the kind which the JRC had provided in terms of draft guidelines, and we did conduct tests on that basis. The report is currently being finalised and will then be sent to the national parliament, and from there will be disseminated to the Commission and others.
Can you tell us if there is a car that had a defeat device in the next report you will publish, please?
U kunt begrijpen dat...
Thank you. You'll understand that I cannot second guess that. and we have to first has to transit via our national parliament. It's first got to be put to the national parliament before we can talk about the next steps.
Over aan het Europese parlement.
And then I hope that the very next day it finds its way into the European Parliament. Thank you, Mr. Gebrandi.
Ja, dank u wel, mevrouw de voorzitter. Even heel concreet.
Thank you in very practical terms, do you have a date for the completion of the test and for it to then go to the national Dutch Parliament? No, I haven't got a date as such, but it will be the end of this month. Okay, well, I think it was scheduled for September earlier on. Can I just ask, the present day, today, what do we do with cars which are demonstrably non-compliant with the legislation and which have received type approval? For example, the Opel Zavira. There have been studies which have indicated that they have a large multiple of emissions on the road than in the lab. And yet the RDW produced the final type approval for them. Now, is it then up to the RDW, if necessary, to withdraw the certification that it has awarded? Thank you. The RDW provided the overarching type approval, but the basic elements of that were produced by the KBA with regard to the Opel Zavira. Now, we can only record that once we get further information from the KBA about the next steps which would be required for the emissions type approval, because the KBA really are ultimately responsible for that. Well, yes, but the RDW gave the total type approval. The KBA did the emissions type approval part of that. Under EU legislation, the RDW will at some point need to officially go to the German type approval authority and ask them to take the necessary measures. No, it's the other way around. First of all, it's got to be demonstrated that there is something amiss, that the Germany or the KBA would then need to inform us whether this would have consequences for type approval. And we, as the RDW, have not ourselves observed anything. We depend there on the KBA vis-à-vis Opel. Yeah, but you know the University of Bern study, you will be aware of the questions which were put to the Flemish VRT, and this is the case of the Opel Zavira. And I can imagine that you, as the ultimate responsible body for the type approval, may well feel that you are in, as it were, the hot seat. And have you pressed the KBA to complete their study as quickly as possible and to send the results your way? Now, is there anything amiss? That is something which will flow from the KBA findings with regard to the Opel Zavira. It's not something which is going to be dictated by an article which claims that something is amiss. But you're in touch with the KBA. Do you know the thrust of the study, what the likely findings are going to be? No, we do not yet have a final view from the KBA which would trigger further action. Yes, but you have an idea of the general thrust of the inquiry. No, we are awaiting a result from the KBA, and we can simply take note thereof. Thank you. I'm sorry, that's a bit passive. I could imagine that you, as the authority responsible for final type approval, on the basis of sub-type approvals, that you might feel a responsibility for the final type approval, because there is only one authority which can withdraw it, and that would be you. In conjunction with the KBA, I think you would need, under the legislation, to be in touch with them, but it does seem a little bit passive. Particularly this has been a lot of headlines on the subject, and a great deal of interest. Could that not have speeded things up a little? And with regard to the Opel Severa, is that part of your own study area? No, it's not part of our own research field. Now, do we need to act? I think here the responsibility does lie with the authority providing the emissions type approval to see whether, in connection with Opel, this should be deemed to be illegal use of software. But until such time as that has been determined, there are no formal steps which we can take. And as I've already indicated, checking and testing what is and what is not deemed to be a defeat device or an illegal defeat device, that's something which must be undertaken in conjunction with the Commission and with the various relevant authorities. And there we do need guidelines. We require guidelines for that. And that's got to be harmonised. We need harmonised ground rules across Europe, and not homing in or focusing on one part of the picture, and not looking exclusively at one authority. In the case of Volkswagen, I think the situation was relatively clear. Mr. de Jong. Thank you very much, Madam Chairman. And thanks very much to the RDW for coming here today. Now, Opel, RDW, going for type approval. Why does the RDW do that? Well, I think there's a question to put to Opel, not for me. Well, no, but you, I imagine, have engaged in marketing, and you would want to attract that kind of business. Could you be a bit more specific? Because I'm not sure if I have really grasped the context. Well, it's really a question of the funding of the financing of RDW in terms of the testing department. Well, the funding of RDW is exactly the same kind of thing as with other type approval authorities across Europe, where a service is provided, a fee is charged for that. And that's got to basically cover the costs. And then with the RDW, that's exactly the same thing. So you will get manufacturers going to the RDW, and they're simply paying the going rate. And that's not a big, in budget terms, there is not a lot to choose between different authorities. Well, we perform, if you like, a social activity as the RDW, not just type approval. That's part of the RDW's area of activities. And I'm sure you'll have taken it from my presentation and my replies, that we play a role in the whole process of evolving improved rules and regulations in the automotive sector. Mr. de Jong. No. I wanted to stick to the budget side, because a quarter of your income comes from your test facilities, and that's pretty unique across Europe. And I imagine that income is welcome, even if it's not commercial, but it does seem to be a worthwhile thing. Well, I think you'd have to ask the director and not me as an expert on the emissions legislation. I think what you can say is that undertaking this activity is something which we in the RDW provide as a service. And that does involve, we have the manpower, we have the expertise, and we do that in approved fashion. So we've got 25 people This is a small part of the 1,400 total on the payroll. And that's important as a source of information about the entire process of type approval and testing. And lessons can be learned for improving legislation. Mr. de Jong. In that case, we're talking one of the few type approval authorities which it conducts its own tests. And if we then ask about things about defeat devices and on-road emissions, lab emissions, it doesn't seem we're getting very much further forward than what's happening elsewhere. Are you independent from the KBA? And it does lead one to suggest that the test authority itself did not loom large in this overall process in terms of simply implementing what is set out in the legislation. Well, that's not really a question, that's more, I think, of a statement. But if we're talking about improving the legislation, well, if you go back to 2010, we were putting in place the RDE legislation, and that did depend on the results which were of the tests which we were producing on behalf of manufacturers. And that's very important for our work. We are concerned, we are minded to contribute in the legislation. Mr. de Jong, well, you mentioned TNO. You've got your own test facilities. You said that this was not a commercial thing. We're there for social, we have a social mission, and yet no one over that period in RDW thought this is something we've got to really look into. No, I must say that we work very closely together with TNO over many years. As long as I've been engaged in this, on this international dimension, seeking to improve the legislation. And I know the TNO, and they are also, information from there is shared with the Dutch Parliament. And at no point was the question raised as to should we be homing in on defeat devices. And that is because we were in the process of devising the RDE, the road testing, the on-road testing project. And that was where the focus was over that period.
Meneer Eickhout.
Dank u wel, voorzitter. Dank u wel, meneer Reinders, voor uw...
Thank you very much, and thank you to Mr. Reinders for that reply. Can we just go back to a question I put to before? Who is responsible for the fact that who is responsible for 5.1.5 Part 1 of the air quality? Article 1 is in normal use, and Article 2 is no defeat devices. And I'm just very interested. Thank you. That's one article. Well, there's also Article 5.3. Yes, but I'm saying who is responsible for Article 5A and 5B? Well, Regulation 715/2007 sets out the basic requirements which need to be fulfilled in normal conditions of use as regards emissions. But I'm asking who's responsible for making sure that there is compliance with that, with Article 5. Well, the authorities which do the type approval on the basis of the implementation regulation, they have responsibility for the vehicle being compliant with those criteria. In other words, the RDW. Well, if RDW conducts the tests as part of the implementation regulation requirements, 96/2008, and if that is in compliance with the relevant tests, not just the NEDC, and who checks on compliance? Who checks whether you are compliant? Well, those are the tests which are then carried out. They can be witnessed by the technical services, and there's a very complicated arrangement for tests. And it's not just type 1, in other words, NEDC. You've got a hot test, a cold test. You haven't got a TNO test, though. No. There is one test which is described as one which has to be representative for the general determination of normal conditions of use. Do you think that cars currently, which are factor 6, factor 7, in other words 6 or 7 times more than lab conditions, are they compliant? Thank you. Well, the vehicles which are currently being tested, no, the ones way back in 2007. Well, at that time there were no demands in terms of RDE. No, I'm talking about compliant with in normal use and under the limits. 2010, it was known that the emissions were excessive, and you were the authority which type approved that. And are you compliant with Article 5A, which is the law? Well, those were general provisions, general requirements. You can say that a vehicle is safe, but what are the criteria used to test that? Mr. Eickhout, well, what criteria do you use? Well, we look at the harmonised requirements which are set out, and that's the NEDC tests. Yes, but it's been well known for a long time that lab tests were not sufficient and they were not compliant with 5A, and all you can still do is the lab tests. That's quite correct. We only have lab tests available to us, as I said at the very start of my remarks. With setting up the Euro 5 and Euro 6 requirements in the regulation. Where does it say in the law that you can only undertake NEDC tests? No, implementation is in the 2008 regulation, and it's on that basis that type approval is issued, is provided. And that's the implementation. In other words, anything goes. Well, not exactly. In testing a vehicle, you have a prototype which simply indicates that it fulfills the legal requirements. And then you have conformity of production, COP, and in-service conformity, ISC. And they are also imposed upon the manufacturer, who must ensure that that's met when the vehicle goes into production. And how do you check whether the manufacturer has done that? For example, the Opel Zafira. Well, the Opel Zafira is not a type approval which was provided by the RDW. Yes, but you're responsible for the overall type approval. You get components from various authorities. You, not you personally, RDW has overall responsibility for the type approval of the Opel Zafira. In other words, you are responsible for compliance with, and for example, that the COP has been done properly. Have you checked that the COP, conformity of production, was done properly? Well, control of COP and in-service conformity was done with regard to emissions done by the KBA, because they provided type approval for that part. Okay, well, very good. That's a real brick wall there.
Mrs. Evi.
Grazie. Thank you.
Dunque, io vorrei chiedere...
I'd like to ask you, in 2011, the debate started on the introduction of RDE tests, and then already in the 715/2007 regulation, 8 years in advance, the manufacturers were aware of the limit values that they would have to respect as of 2014, so for Euro 6. So do you believe that it's necessary to give more time to car manufacturers so that they can guarantee that vehicle emissions respect the limit values on the road as they have done with the tests for the conformity of the product? Can you give me your opinion on this?
Ja, dank u wel voor die...
Thank you very much for your question. The vehicles which were checked using Euro 6 needed to fulfill the requirements under Euro 6. And that's still NEDC testing. If the vehicles pass that test with type approval, they are then looked at for conformity of production and in-service conformity. That's the entire spectrum which is currently regulated by law. Introduction of RDE and the first package thereof is under implementation. That's currently underway, but the conformity criterion of 2.1 does not yet apply, and that is a pity that it was not there with the entry into force of Euro 6, but that is the situation.
Okay, grazie.
Thank you. I'll move on to another question. I didn't get to the response that I wanted, or that I was hoping for. In the light of your experience, do you believe that in the future the RDE tests using the PEMS technology will be adapted to a certain extent or manipulated by manufacturers? Because in an earlier hearing, this scenario seemed to be likely in the near future, or possible anyway. Is it so? Do you think that it's possible that car manufacturers might, to a certain extent, manipulate not just the test bench tests in the laboratory, but also might manipulate the new instrument, the RDE?
Dank u wel voor deze vraag.
Thank you very much for that question. In the Netherlands, with the development of RDE, we have paid very careful attention to that exact issue. One of the factors involved there was information from the ECU, the management system of the vehicle, to tap into that to see when it came to the data. And we really pushed to ensure that tapping into information was not necessary, so that the vehicle does not know that it's being tested under RDE. And these were all elements which were specifically inputted by the Dutch authorities into the RDE discussions. Of course, you cannot give a 100% guarantee, but the current guarantees, the current criteria set out in RDE do provide for good protection, that it is tamper-proof.
Grazie molte per la risposta.
Thank you very much for your reply. One last brief question. Do you think that it might be useful to plan that the type approval authorities have an in-house technical service just devoted to carrying out tests for the type approval of new models and for the checking of conformity of production, rather than having external technical services doing that job?
Ik weet niet of ik uw vraag goed heb begrepen.
Thank you very much. Well, if I understand that question correctly, the RDE test is part and parcel of the type approval testing. And as I indicated in my initial presentation, the fourth package also means that independent parties can conduct the RDE tests. And they can also provide data, information as to whether the vehicle is compliant. The RDE is a demonstration test, and if it's 25 degrees outside, you need to see what how the vehicle behaves at 25 degrees rather than, say, 2 degrees. So the RDE tests provides an important element which helps in establishing other areas, other boundary conditions for tests. And then the manufacturer will be able to say that the vehicle meets the requirements across the whole range of RDE, and that I think is one of the strengths of RDE itself.
Mr. Schulze for 2 time slots.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Since I don't speak Dutch, I'll speak German. Mr. Reiners, thank you very much for coming to Belgium today from the Netherlands to be asked questions by a German. I have a question which I've asked your colleagues today already, and also yesterday, a technical question about component protection. I'd like to repeat one specific question. I'd like to know from you whether, from your point of view, there may be defeat devices in order to protect components, as the legislation says, directly or indirectly, irrespective of what is known about how manufacturers interpret component protection.
Dank u wel voor die vraag.
Thank you very much for that question. For the manufacturers, well, they have their own responsibility to ensure that the equipment they install to keep emissions low work properly. If for whatever reason a particular component of the emission mitigation system can be switched off because the engine needs to be protected, then that must be technically possible. However, the fact remains that the overall system must still function in such a way that the average emissions remain within a particular range and remain under control over a time window. And under RDA there are normalization tools. You can have peaks, in other words spikes, but over a range the average values have to remain under control. Now, a system which can be switched on and off must not be, that's perfectly possible, parts of it, but the overall system cannot simply be switched off for unacceptable reasons, for example, to save fuel or to reduce fuel consumption.
I interpret your statement such that what we've heard over recent months about manufacturers doing with component protection, so certain temperatures, switching things off after certain periods of time, that normal users of vehicles have asked what that has to do with normal use. Is that a false interpretation of component protection in your view?
Ja,
Thank you. Answering the question whether switching off a particular component which is part of the emission abatement system, whether that is permissible or not, depends on a range of factors. Hence the complication of looking at that from the outside and coming to an absolute judgment. It's important to look at the reasons and the arguments why the strategy operates in a particular way. Is that acceptable? Is a question which you can ask. It does require a degree of expertise. You can put the question directly to the manufacturers, but it's a very difficult avenue to pursue. It's not straightforward to say this is unacceptable. You really have to look at all of the arguments and the technicalities which would be used to say whether something is acceptable or not.
Dank für diese Antwort.
Okay, thank you very much. A question in a different direction in the last minute. You also carry out market surveillance. You test vehicles on the market which have type approval, which are subjected to random tests. How many of these vehicles have you checked per year over recent years on average, and have these random tests increased after the release of the events in recent years, in particular Dieselgate?
Dank u wel.
Thank you very much. You have to distinguish between two different kinds of surveillance. When you talk about surveillance by the authorities which provided type approval to the manufacturer, there the type approval authority has a duty to see to look into conformity of production done by the manufacturer, to see whether that has been done properly, and to make sure that that is in conformity with the rules. Otherwise, the testing process cannot continue. But there are also vehicles which are in use, which have done 100,000, 160,000 kilometres. Do they meet the same criteria? And that's part of the type approval process. If you're talking about market surveillance, that of course is a completely different kettle of fish. And RDW does not do that. We do not do that kind of market surveillance. We don't simply go out and look at vehicles on the Dutch market and check them, test them. Now, if you look at the tests done by the TNO, they do a kind of test to look at the performance of vehicles in terms of their emissions, diesel or gasoline, to see how they perform in the real world, and then they produce models mapping air quality. But that gives you an idea of the spectrum of type approval. Who does market surveillance? What's the authority responsible for market surveillance in the Netherlands? Well, that would be the Ministry of Infrastructure and the Environment. They can commission market surveillance. That would be the Inspectorate for Transport. And they do the actual road testing. I'm afraid you'll have to put that to the Ministry exactly what they do. Well, we will, says the Chair. Mr. Paolucci.
Thank you. Two simple and brief questions, so we can save a bit of time. The first question. Yesterday, the Italian approval authority said that they know of cases where newly approved vehicles in Italy were then approved by other national authorities. And I'd like to know whether you've been aware of similar cases. Has this happened in the Netherlands?
Ik kan u daar geen antwoord op geven. Ik weet dat niet.
I'm sorry, I do not know.
Va bene, grazie per la
Fine, well, thanks for that lack of answer. But secondly, it's more than a question. It's really an expression of my curiosity. Your authority is the third largest in Europe as regards numbers of vehicles approved, although the Netherlands doesn't have a real car industry. Can you explain the reasons for your extraordinary success?
Ik denk dat de RDW...
Well, I think that the RDW is a reliable partner. And it does a very business-like job, efficiency in terms of its competence, its skill, and its effectiveness. That, I think, those are the keys to our success. Now, I'm not here to provide a plug for ourselves, but I think that we do make a contribution, and we can claim to be an organisation which is prompt, speedy, effective in providing type approval. And I think that that really is something which attracts manufacturers to the Netherlands seeking type approval from the RDW for their vehicles.
Grazie.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mrs. Ayala Sender.
Sí, gracias.
Thank you. Along the same lines as Mr. Paolucci, I was impressed because in 2013, 2014, you didn't assemble any vehicles, but in 2015, you did put together the Tesla, which just arrived on the market. So I'd like to know whether your organisation has already carried out any certification of the Tesla. And then, if you don't mind, Chair, the next question linked to the report that you're going to be presenting at the end. I'd like to know how you divide the work between the Joint Research Centre and your work. Who pays whom? How have you organised this cooperation between the Public Research Centre, which we finance from the European budget, the Joint Research Centre, and your organisation, which is independent and which I presume has a different set-up to a public body? So could you explain how you've organised this, and how you're going to give us a report? I mean, I presume that and how can you give us information about models that you don't manufacture yourselves?
Ik hoop dat ik uw vraag goed kan beantwoorden.
Thank you. I'm not sure whether I'm going to be able to answer that question. It's not an easy question really to get into one's site. On Tesla. Oh yes, on Tesla. Well, yes indeed. That was a manufacturer where we provided the certificate, a fully electrical vehicle, no emissions, zero emissions, which is easy to arrive at by way of conclusion. And that was a type of approval which we provided to Tesla. Was there another question, or was that the only question?
Sí, ¿cómo ha sido el montaje?
Yes, but what was the financial setup for cooperation with the Joint Research Centre, the European Joint Research Centre, and the setup for cooperation between you and your organisation and GRC? You said that you were cooperating with them in order to provide the report, which will then go to the Dutch Parliament and to the European Parliament a little later. So what's this? Who's paid for what? How have you cooperated with the JRC? What was the financial setup?
Ja, onderzoeken die wij hebben gedaan.
Well, for tests we conduct, we have our own resources. And all of the testing which we do is paid for, the test which we have to do is paid for by the RDW. And that's self-financed from our own accounts. This is not my particular area of expertise, and colleagues may want to supplement me. Perhaps my colleague could answer.
Because you said that the centre had helped you a lot. You said that at the beginning of your presentation, because I thought it was rather strange that you've been helped. I just want to know how you organise that cooperation with the JRC.
Ja, JRC is een...
Well, the JRC is a scientific institute, and it supports the work of the European Commission. And in the RDE legislation, JRC was a major partner undertaking the analyses and devising models for the PEMS equipment, and deciding what kind of cycle is required for RDE. Now, if we're looking to find ways of making useful contributions, well, we work with TNO, which is the Ministry of Infrastructure and the Environment. And I'm very grateful to avail myself of the TNO's considerable resources to help us make a contribution to improving the real driving situation and work as well.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. I'll come back to exchange of information. In the written answers to question 1, you said that there's no exchange of information between the technical services in Europe. I'm not irritated. The Italian colleague said that if a vehicle fails in Italy, the other technical services are informed. So you have no exchange of information in any form whatsoever.
Thank you very much. Information from the technical services. In principle, that is not exchanged. But when it comes to the type approval authorities, that information is exchanged. So if there is a test report from a technical service, which goes to a technical service and indicates that the vehicle is not going to pass the test because it does not fulfill the requirements, at that point the type approval authorities can inform other type approval authorities about that case. And that form of pathway does exist for such communication.
Okay, vielen Dank dafür.
Thank you very much for that. In the current type approval regime, we have the problem of financial independence. Compared to America, it was said that the non-direct financing from state financing in America is the better system. If you compare the European system, and colleagues have asked about this already, direct independence of fees, in your case 25% of your turnover, the comparison between the Netherlands and America, or rather the European system pitted against the American system, is the American system better?
Ja, kwalificatie geven is...
Well, giving marks to different systems is very difficult because each system has got its own strengths and weaknesses, I think. The European system, subject to the current adaptations taking place in Council, is an effective system for supervision of vehicles. It requires cooperation between member states and between type approving authorities. And the communication elements are there, the building blocks of communication are in place. And the European Commission provides guidelines for contributions from the different authorities, and at council level they're looking at accreditation for testing houses, peer pressure, and so on, which is conducive to improving legislation. The American system of self-certification has other drawbacks, other disadvantages. The vehicle can be on the roads, and only then is it found that something is wrong, at which point there are major consequences which flow from that sequence of events. And that is always going to be a risk element for the manufacturer, because there are going to be stiff penalties involved.
Thank you very much for that. Penultimate technical question, which I also put to the French colleague today. The question of the measurement exactitude of PEMPs. The French colleague said that they're going towards 100%, but with a tolerance of 20%. Can you confirm that value?
De PEMS-apparatuur voor de...
Thank you very much. PEMS equipment for emissions, quite apart from PEMS, which is specifically devised for components, so rather for the number of particulates and NOx of the kind which is currently looked into under NDC is under 2%. There are different tolerances, however, for so-called test aligning, but at the end of the day, the uncertainty about vehicle testing with PEMS is 0.5 as the overall package. So that's a component, 0.2 for the equipment, and then uncertainties in the overall package is 0.5%, bottom line. And these are figures which have been provided by to the JRC and also to the Commission.
Okay, vielen Dank.
Thank you. A final question, 5 seconds. We had the German, if we had the German Transport Minister here, if you were to put a question to him, what would it be?
Ja, ik heb niet duidelijk een...
Well, they're very, what indeed? I think I would simply push the idea of a broad cooperation between different authorities. That's what I would be looking for.
Wordt gefluisterd over de Opel Zafira.
Someone mentioned the Opel Zafira somewhere. Noise is off. Therese Griffin, please.
Thank you, Chair. It's becoming apparent that the lack of coordination or harmonisation in the approach of the type approval authorities across Europe has in part helped to create the situation we currently find ourselves in, with TAAs interpreting EU legislation concerning permissible exemption from the ban on defeat devices seemingly on a case-by-case basis. You've touched on some of this, but in your answer specifically to question 12, you admit that switching off the emission control system after 22 minutes of engine operation is a prohibited defeat device. Your Italian colleagues, however, did not find it suspicious enough to conduct investigations into the matter and did not prolong the standard duration of the test to verify if these allegations could be confirmed. Could you please comment on that, and can you please explain the difference in approach between two European TAAs? Thank you.
Dank u wel. De zienswijze.
Thank you very much. The approach to the criteria as to when something is a defeat device in a vehicle or not is something which will have to be done Europe-wide on a harmonised basis. And there we need guidelines from the Commission. But before we get these guidelines, we still have various type approval authorities, and they need to provide their input as to what kind of guidelines need to be applied across Europe-wide. And I'm not talking there about one specific methodology, but we're talking here about, for example, the switching off of a complete emission abatement system after 20 minutes of which is the duration of the NEDC test. I don't think you could justify that being necessary simply in order to protect the engine. That is something which we would need to discuss with the manufacturer. Why is that necessary? And really descend into particulars there and see whether that belongs as an exception to the defeat devices ban. Now, the technical services type approval authorities, they may have their views, but the thing is that at European level, we're trying to come to an agreed line. And the best way there is to have those guidelines which will be of general application to the technical services and the type approval authorities. What we need there is harmonisation. Thank you.
Thank you. Are you confident that those steps will result in a member state not finding it very easy to cheat?
Dat is ook mijn hoop en wens.
Well, that's my hope and aspiration. We're still very much in mid-process there. We, according to Dutch studies, we're not there yet, but we fully intend to make our proper input in order to help that process along. And this will help to improve the guidelines. The Commission has said that they're going to produce guidelines in order to get uniformity in the approach across Europe, so that we don't find one authority accepting a particular defeat device and others not doing that, because at present we do have a range of different views. However, the guidelines would need to be legally binding. These would then be the ground rules which are being discussed, and not be dependent upon individual TAAs or technical services.
It's helpful, thank you.
Thank you very much. Meneer Gerbrandy, wilt u nog terugkomen?
Mr. Gerbrandy.
Voorzitter.
Yes, thank you, Madam Chairman. I'd love to. Can I just make use of the long experience of Mr. Reinders in the RDE process? 2006, the Commission established that a new procedure was required. It took until November 2010, 4 years minimum, before the workshop could be held. And then it took 5 years before the first package of the RDE thing was ready. 2010, it was thought that would take 2 years. Why has the process taken almost a decade, 10 years? Can you explain that? Can't believe that it's that technically complicated.
Dank u wel. Op het laatste.
Thank you. With the last point first. It is technically complicated. Yes, but it shouldn't take 10 years. Surely get the brightest and best together. They should be able to emerge from that darkened room after a year. Well, we also hope that would be the case. It depends on the level of ambition. 2011, January, that was the kick-off with the RDE process. There was a job there for the manufacturers and the type approval authorities. They all had to be on side. And what was the political reason why this was also difficult and so fraught? Well, with hindsight, of course, it's easy to have 2020 vision. But at the time, we were very insistent. We talked about normal conditions of use. That was something which we tested using harmonized methods, which was the NEDC, which was supposed to be a reflection of tests of that kind. And the vehicles and the trailers were going to be tested using those that method. But at the end of the day, it did seem that the limits were separate from the tests we were looking at. We could have had different tests. But that required a change of mindset. And of course, RDE was the avenue which has since then been pursued, has been explored. Well, yes, but 2011 was 5 years after 2006, which is when the Commission realised something new was needed. And it does seem that was 5 years of inactivity. Let me repeat my question. It's not just the manufacturers, it's also the type approval authorities. We've put questions to manufacturers who had an important role to play there. But my question to you is this. Were there other interests which came into play rather than just the technicalities? Did the member states play politics? Did the manufacturers slow things down? Did they drag their heels? Well, it's very difficult to form a definitive judgment. I have followed this from the inception, from the get-go, and have been seeking to bring about improvement, contribute to improvements all along. But developing an evaluation tool itself took 3 years. And that was simply to devise a model for on-road driving with a PEMS equipment so that you could get proper analysis of the data and have feedback system to a limit. For example, 80 micrograms per kilometre of NOx emissions. And that was an evaluation tool. There was a range of options available. There was the heavy-duty channel, using PEMS testing. But there were a big difference between heavy vehicles and other vehicles.
In French. Je rebondis.
I'll come back to what Teresa Griffin said. And it's difficult to harmonise various national authorities when it comes to type approvals and when it comes to what is and what is not a defeat device. Don't you think that the report that you will present to your authorities will be made on the JRC guidelines? Wouldn't it be better to have a European level if they're outside of this regulation when it comes to defeat devices? Secondly, the best way to get to that, wouldn't it be via a European authority which would be above national authorities and which would allow, where there are disagreements, they could harmonise and make a decision if there are any disagreements?
Op uw eerste vraag.
Thank you. To answer the first question you put, yes. The experience gleaned from various programs and from our own test programs, which we carried out, can be put into the process of discussion with the Commission in order to develop guidance as to whether something is or is not a defeat device. Now, learning lessons from that, do we need to withdraw type approval decisions? That's exactly what we're looking at. For example, Euro 5 vehicles, their type approval, has it lapsed? No new vehicles can be put on the market. We're looking for Euro 6. And there we would be looking at vehicles which are still on sale, still on the market. And we would need then to if you like, zoom in, to home in on that category of vehicles. But I think that it's important for this to be a collective effort, and not just each authority simply beavering away in its own area. And I think that there has to be a general discussion so that we can see what is required to protect the engine and how you draw the line and decide what is permissible and not permissible in terms of defeat devices. You asked there was a second part to your question, which was, should there be an overarching authority? I think that in the discussion at council level, with the new regulation on type approval and market surveillance, that's where those negotiations, those discussions are still in full swing.
Independent agency, and what is proposed by the Commission is not independent. That my question is an independent, just like the European Railway Agency, you see.
Als ik het dan terugga naar de
Well, if I can go back to emissions legislation, there is a fourth package of RDE, which includes independent party testing. And if you like, that is a kind of market surveillance element in the fourth package.
De wetgeving die nu in het parlement zit rond de type approval en market surveillance en het parlement, of in ieder geval een
there is legislation coming through now on the question of type approval and market surveillance, asking is there a requirement there for coordination of market surveillance at European level. That really was, I think, the question.
Ik had al begin aangegeven dat ik...
Thank you. I did say earlier on that I was not the person to ask for, about a ringside view of what's happening at council level in this area. One hears reports. But certainly we are all in favour of any improvements which the Commission is able to bring forward. And we would be happy were there to be some kind of panel which had independence in terms of its surveillance and being a kind of arbitrator in the event of disagreements between the technical services and TAAs. And there is certainly a role for something along those lines, a panel.
Ja, dank u wel.
Thank you very much. Simply to round off and to wrap up, I wanted to ask exactly what happens. How are we going to get a definition of defeat devices? The Italians are saying that for their Fiat, there are no defeat devices. And now you come along and you may agree or not agree, but you haven't got the data. So how do you come to a conclusion? Well, the discussions actually take place in a separate working group of the Commission. It's basically the DAEG, and there is a subgroup on market surveillance there. No, let's just keep the focus on defeat devices. I mentioned the Italians because yesterday we had Fiat, they came along and answered our questions. But if the Italian authorities doesn't provide the data and says that on the basis of our data that is not a defeat device and you're in your working group, what do you make of that?
Ja, in feite kan de Europese Commissie...
Well, in point of fact, the Commission can adopt its guidelines and then indicate that these are the criteria. And then the Italian authorities will need to comply with that. Well, yesterday they came along and they talked about 70% being the figure, and they actually defended what Fiat has been doing, but they didn't provide all the data. And it's they simply say we've done our studies, it's not a defeat device, and you're left with their verdict. And what do you do if that's the case? Well, for the time being, there is a dialogue taking place between the German authorities and the Italian authorities. The Commission is, if you like, holding the ring there, is there to provide a mediation function. But the end result of that process may well be a guideline which we hope, says Mr. Reinders, will be binding. Well, that would be one way that EU legislation could go. But you do know, surely, sir, that the defeat devices have been in the legislation for a long, long time. And then nothing was done about that until 2015, Euro 6. And it came as a great surprise. And now the question is, what transparency is there? What's the input from member states? How can we oversee what they're doing? And is it going to lead anywhere? Well, I think this does raise the whole question of the commonality, where the Commission collects all the contributions in order to come up with guidelines. And I think that is a process. How long is it going to take? Well, I think there's a head of steam there now. There's a lot of pressure, and it's really for the Commission, and they are working with dispatch to produce those guidelines. In the RDW, we are not happy with simply doing beavering away in our own corner. We produce our own preferred solution and are looking forward to the Commission producing those guidelines. Well, I think we've got to take Mr. Anders at his word there. I'm sure that all of the member states want to get those guidelines, but it depends on what the input they have. I think there's a lack of transparency. We'll be able to come back to that. Well, I hope we do. Thank you very much.